All right. So today we're going to look at sort of political evolution in Greece in general, but mainly in Athens. And it's tricky here because typically you want to talk about what the standard thing was. What did the average typical Greek polis do to govern itself? How did they decide? How did the people there decide what the best form of governance was? However, we don't tend to know about them as much because all the people who were doing writing, they all lived in Athens. And even the language that they spoke and wrote in Athens, Attic Greek, became sort of considered to be the highest standard and the best form of Greek. So you were more likely to have things written in Attic Greek survive down the road, which is great, but Athens had a very unique political structure. Having said all that, it's the one that influences Western politics down to today. So yeah, maybe it's useful if we do see how it evolved and changed and grew and that fun stuff. All right, these are the main characters in the story and the years that they were, either the 1 year that was sort of tied to them. You can see that it happens over a period of 125 years. So it's a slow process, as you'd expect it to be. All the terms in red are kind of the key terms. Some of them a little more difficult to pronounce than others. Anyway. There we go, turn it on. All right, so it starts with the Basileus or Basileus, you can say either one, the hereditary king. And we don't know a lot. We don't have written contemporary sources about this. So a lot of this is just working on probability and what we expect normally happens in these situations. In Athens, where they wrote about their history from a distance, so beware, there seemed to be three elements to governance. There was the king, there was a wealthy elite that was a council to the king, and then there was the assembly of people. That gets repeated a ton throughout history. Cultures that have nothing to do with each other often find their way to this arrangement where you have the hereditary ruler, but then you have a council of people who have power and influence and money, who advise him on what they want. But the Athenians also had an assembly, and we know it goes back this far. The Areopagus was, way back when, was the name of the council, but it was also the place where they met, which is the Hill of Ares. How this worked in Athens or other cities would vary, because in some cases you probably had a really autocratic monarch. In some places you'd have a bit more collaboration. Typically collaboration happens when the monarch is forced to collaborate, like King John and Magna Carta. Sometimes there's a bit of, what's the term, enlightened self-interest, where a monarch doesn't particularly want to share power, but realizes that it's better than having it ripped out from him. Anyway, the assembly of the people, I should define as basically the men of military serving age. And that was like the main way that you contributed to your community, was by being able to defend it from attack. So that's the skin that you have in the game, is that you're providing your manpower to keep the community chugging along, but particularly to keep the community safe. Anyway, in a lot of polis, The elites took over more and more of the governance powers from the basileus. And in time, the king, unless they were themselves an elite who were successful, they have a big household, they have a lot of support, they have a lot of followers, they have a lot of money. If they don't have those necessary qualifications to be elite, if it's just birth, then they get kind of marginalized as time goes on. And you transition to that council of elites ruling. And typically, it is the council of the elites. It takes a while to build up a fortune, particularly if it's based on agriculture. So once you get there, you tend to stay there for quite a while as well. So the elites, it is something that is handed down from generation to generation. But it's mainly because, X's son inherits his wealth and his lands and what have you. And that's what qualifies him to being a member of the elite. And a lot of poleis stopped there. It seemed to work. You had reasonable stability, and you didn't get any farther. The only instability would come about when you had two factions in the oligarchy who disagreed violently with each other. Each one wanted to have the primary position, and they were about equal. So kind of you'd think Republicans and Democrats, except it wasn't based on principle. It was just based on, we want to be in charge. No, we want to be in charge. So you could get some kind of civil strife going on.
It was between the basileus and the oligarch and the elites?
No, this would be now we've got an oligarchy set up. The king is just kind of a ceremonial function, often a religious function, but not really governance anymore. But now you've got, let's say you've got 20 powerful heads of households. Yeah. And it's like 8 of them are aligned. They want to be more in charge. They want to have more control. There's another 8 over here, and then there's 4 who are kind of like, we're small. We are small. We're down to like the 17th, 18th, 19th. So we'll support this one. Oh, now we'll support that one, depending on just interpersonal relationships. But it's the oligarchies going back and forth like that.
So it's a little more like almost Canada's system where we've got the people who are in power, and then the monarchy is just sort of symbolic.
Mm-hmm. It's very similar to that. So that's typically what happens. Another form of government that crops up either after an oligarchy, sometimes before, but typically it is one that follows oligarchy, is a tyrant. Now, we have an image in our heads of what a tyrant is, and it's very different in the Greek world. A tyrant sounds like someone who violently seizes power and holds it in like a military dictatorship. That's the kind of thing you picture. And you also picture someone that no one can stand. Right? Tyrant does not have a positive. In the ancient Greek world, a tyrant is just someone who is ruling as an individual, not hereditary, and not sort of automatically hereditary like a king. And that's all it is. A lot of times tyrants became tyrants because they had the support of a large section of the community. So they didn't seize, they might have some military weight there getting them in power, but they also need support. And we'll see some examples of both what happens when you don't have support, what happens when you do have support. However, often the tyrant's son becomes the tyrant after them. And there's kind of a rule of thumb here that you don't if you have a tyrant who's good, that ability to be good it doesn't tend to get passed down genetically. It's not a genetic thing that you're a good tyrant. And so it doesn't last for very many generations. Anyway, so for example, here's one, because we've got to get outside of Athens. Cypselus of Corinth was installed as the tyrant after the last king was assassinated. So they assassinate the king. He obviously did have governmental powers. They install Cypselus. He was successful. His son was actually considered one of the 7 sages of the ancient Greek world. So he was very well respected. But Periander's son obviously stunk because in 3 years they turfed him. So it's not like in 3 years they said, you know what, we have a fundamental, principled problem with tyranny. It's, no, we have a fundamental problem with this one guy. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing that you would see happen. It's a fairly common pattern. By the way, there's Corinth. Useful to know about Corinth because they're going to crop up. You can see how close they are to Athens. So obviously they're going to bump into each other regularly. Anyway, some other exempla of tyrannoi. So tyrannoi is the plural of tyrannus or tyrant. Miltiades became the tyrant of the Chersonese at the request of the people who lived there. He actually wasn't. He didn't come from that community. He was sort of brought in as someone to act as tyrant. The Chersonese, by the way, is up here. And this is a key area because this gets you into the Black Sea, and the Black Sea was quite a breadbasket. There was a lot of trade that went on with the Black Sea. So if you controlled that area, you could kind of create embargoes against communities. Aristodemus of Cumae was a successful army leader. He was installed in a tyrant after he overthrew the aristocracy, oligarchy. But after 15 years, the oligarchy organized itself and overthrew him back again and killed him. Cumae is off in Italy. This was part of this colonization business. And in fact, most of those communities that you're looking at, in fact, I think all of them, are not native communities that sprung up over time with native Italians. These are all Greek colonies that came, set up, were successful, lasted. Yeah.
Why would another group bring in somebody to rule who's not part of their group?
It would have to be somebody who was quite prominent, sort of in the Hellenistic world, in the Greek world. Yeah. It's not very common. It's kind of, in fact, it's extremely unusual. He might have had a relationship with the city. So just as a side thing, they actually had kind of a network of ambassadors and envoys in the ancient Greek world where you might have a family that has a very strong personal connection with another city. And they're native in your city, but they have a very strong family, as I say, personal connection. And so that person would sort of act as the unofficial or official diplomat. So if you were going to have negotiations or you want to send somebody to that city to create an alliance or anything like that, you would send a member of that family to that city because that relationship was already there. So it could be something like that, where Miltiades lived somewhere else, but his family had a strong relationship with the Chersonese peoples. Anyway, what happened in Athens? By the way, a piece of pottery showing potty training doesn't have anything to do with this, and I'm not even making a comment about it. I just kind of a neat slide. You wouldn't expect that someone would put that on pottery, but they did. Anyway, Athens was weird, well, unique at least, because while most cities tended to opt for either a tyrant or an oligarchy and be quite content with that, Athens went democratic. Now, how did they do that? That's what we're going to talk about. You go back, you can see it's an oligarchy that ruled. They had basically 15 people, 9 archons and 6 judges who ruled. The archons were sort of the government branch, and the thesmothetes were the judicial. They didn't rule totally arbitrarily and without any kind of guardrails. The archons swore an oath to act within the law, not to commit an unjust act. So there's at least, whether they did or not is another question, but there is at least a recognition that they can't just do whatever the hell they want. That there are some bounds and rules to keep government effective and reasonably fair. Thesmothetes examined the laws. This is interesting. They kept track of all the cases and all the decisions. So they actually had, kind of an institutional memory about, oh, well, that was what was decided then. Let's not forget. So that's what you had in the 7th century BC in Athens. And then along came Chilon. So he's the first figure that we get to see. By the way, here's just a depiction of jurors casting votes. That's the thesmothetes thing. Anyway, Chilon. Yes. We don't know for sure. We do know with the archons that at one point it was for life. Then it became a 10-year term. So there must have been some kind of a selection process that occurred regularly. Then it became a 1-year term. So they had some selection process. It was not done by a democratic vote of all the men or all the soldiers. It was probably done by the elites, and they kind of chose. But they did, there was, given that they swore an oath, it would have been some kind of formal process. It wouldn't have just been a matter of getting together. It's like, oh yeah, you be the archon now. It would have been more formal than that, because there's other aspects of the role that are formal. So that was a good question. Anyway, Chilon. So Chilon, a former Olympic champion, which seems like a random fact, but matters, in 632 BC, attempted a coup d'etat by seizing the Acropolis. So seizing the highest point in the most easily defended part of the city. Also, the part of the city where you keep your money. So the treasury is kept up on the Acropolis to keep it safe from attack or just thieves. Anyway, didn't work. He did not have, although he was well known and people had good vibes about him because he was an Olympic champion in 640 BC in the 400 meters. We actually know all that. But they were besieged. They were forced to surrender. Chilon escaped, as the leader often does. But his co-conspirators were eventually besieged in the temple of Athena Polios, Athena of the city. That's a very strong taboo to lay violent hands on someone who's in a temple. It goes back to Homer, it goes back to the Iliad. So what they did, it's like, okay, you're going to stand trial. And they were willing to stand trial. That's a reasonable process. But they were scared that if they came out of the temple and they gave up that sanctuary provided by the goddess, that they would just be grabbed. So they tied a rope to the altar, and then they walked out. They're all holding the rope, which is kind of an odd-looking picture you get in your mind. But they're all holding the rope, like we're all safe. The rope either broke or was cut, depending on whose version of the story you hear, at which point they no longer had sanctuary. because they're not attached to the altar. And even though they'd been assured of their safety, as soon as the rope broke, the supporters were all executed by one of the other major leaders in Athens at the time, someone named Megacles. Big guy. Actually, that'd be good if you were doing a version of this story. You could call him Mr. Big. I hadn't thought of that. Anyway, regardless of whether you were on Chilon's side or not, that was considered to be a terrible sacrilege. So as a matter of fact, Megacles and his family were banished, as well as his ancestors. So people who were buried were dug up and kicked out of the city. Anyway, what's interesting is that in 2016, they found 80 people buried near the Acropolis, and they could date the remains to the second half of the 7th century BC, or basically to this period of time, to the 630s, when this occurred. So, although we don't know with absolute certainty that these were the co-conspirators of Chilon, pretty good chance they were. And it's a rare opportunity to have an archaeological find that can be tied to an exact specific event like that. Anyway, why does Chilon matter? Why did I even tell you all that? Well, it's an example of someone trying to become a tyrant in a polis. Their family was a major factor here because Chilon was married to the daughter of the tyrant of neighboring Megara, who helped out. And you would do this. You would get involved in other polises, political, local affairs, if you thought that you could get some value out of it, some influence, right? You get a pro-Megara government in Athens, and then you'll probably get more of your own way when it comes to border disputes, things like that. That is how close Megara is to Athens. It is not very far away at all. And so as a result, just a little side note here, in the ancient Greek world, you tend to have the worst relationships with the polis you are right beside. Those are the ones that you fight with more often than not. On the other hand, the polis that's on the other side of your immediate neighbor, you tend to get along well with them because they're probably fighting with your immediate neighbor as well. And the enemies of my enemies are my friends theory comes here. So, anyway. And the story of the string attached to Athena shows the power of the gods and the recognition of sanctuary. Like, this is a very strong cultural belief. And finally, the expulsion of Megacles reminds us of how, and this happens in literature a lot, that an entire family can be held responsible for one person's actions. So one person does something, the entire family becomes guilty by association. Anyway, oh, not that Draco, that Draco. Draco is the next person who comes along. Fairly soon afterwards, like 12 years. It's sort of a recognition that there is some instability going on when you have somebody who tries to seize power like that, and who does have some support. If he had zero support, he wouldn't have even bothered trying. So there is some instability happening. And the Athenian elites decide that the solution is to create a formal law code that applies to everyone so that there's this, we can create some sort of equality with our citizens. Anybody familiar with the term draconian? Yeah? And what does it mean?
A very harsh attitude or approach to something.
Yes, exactly. Particularly with penalties. Now, we only have the bit about crimes where blood is spilled, so basically murders. But it was all encompassing. Everything was covered by it. But yes, the penalties tended to be very harsh. The story was that somebody said, why do you have the death penalty for like relatively minor infractions? And the story supposedly was because the minor infractions deserve the death penalty, and I can't think of anything bigger for the major infractions. So that's also the death penalty. It wasn't actually as bad as that. It's important because rather than just vendetta between families and getting revenge for a slight and then revenge back again, it's creating a community justice system. And he did recognize gradations of crime. So manslaughter is different from murder, for instance. And that everyone's equal under the law. And not everything was punishable by death. It just seemed like that. So that addressed that part of the inequalities of society. But it didn't address one other aspect of inequality, which was economics. 600 BC, Athens, Attica, has established its economic base. It sort of has figured out what it does well and what it can monetize best. And it tends to be cash crops. Olives, grapes, figs, barley, that wasn't really one to sell. That was the grain that they could grow for local consumption. But they didn't have enough land that grew, and they couldn't grow enough grain to feed the population that they were building up to. So instead of growing a crop that isn't particularly valuable and you can't feed the population anyway, you grow cash crops where you can buy way more grain than you would ever be able to grow yourself. So they have that. That's good. They also have really good clay for pottery. Mount Pentelicus has really high quality marble that you can export as well as use yourself. And the mines at Laurium, which is to the southeast corner, lots of silver there to fund shipbuilding and building programs and all that other kind of fun stuff. So they actually are quite natural resource wealthy. And it's a broad spectrum, right? Crops, clay, marble, silver. That's actually a nice, solid basis, economic basis. If there's a bad crop for olives one year, you've still got a lot of other things you can fall back on. However, not everybody enjoyed the benefits of all this economic stability. Small-holding subsistence farmers who grew just enough or maybe enough and a little bit more to support their oikos or their household, found that there were times when it's a bad crop, and although Athens as a whole has a good broad economic base, you yourself only grow barley. Really? Not yet. You yourself only grow barley. And if it's a bad barley year, you're kind of screwed. So people, in order to try to hold their land, would sell themselves into debt bondage. They became known as the hecatemeroi. And so they would have to give up 1/6 of whatever they produced. So now it's like you've had a bad year, you have to borrow off that. And now you're going to have a regular year plus another 6 just to tread water. If the next year is a bad year, okay, it doesn't take very long before you are so far behind the 8 ball you could never get out of it. And you might not just sell yourself into debt slavery, but you might sell family members into debt slavery as well, just to try to, because you're thinking, okay, the next year there'll be a decent crop and we'll get out of this. But it's creating a gulf where you have landless poor, and then you have the people who are wealthy and successful who can afford to loan money. And when the debt comes due, it's like, okay, I get your land and you're my slave, or I can sell you to someone else. So that kind of gulf where you're losing the middle ground and you're building up people who are either very poor or very wealthy is going to create political instability. And even after Draco did the laws, still have political instability. So they actually chose Solon, who was Archon in 594, to make some kind of reforms. And this is one of these moments where it's tempting to see a person stepping out and almost pushing against the direction that social forces are going and turning it 180 degrees in another direction. So what he did, this will be the last slide, by the way. What he did was he introduced something called seisaktheia. And that is debt relief. If you were in a position of debt bondage or debt slavery, that debt that you owed that put you into that bondage was forgiven. You didn't owe it anymore. He actually went back because, I might have gotten into debt bondage. So now this other person owns me and they sold me off to somebody in Corinth because they got a good price for me, surprisingly enough. Solon went to the guy who bought me and bought me back, bought my freedom so that I could come back and be a citizen in Athens again. As I said, he was wealthy. He also offered citizenship to attract people to come to Athens, which is very rare because typically you are your polis and no one else is going to accept you. So you don't immigrate anywhere, or you don't emigrate. But he wanted to attract skilled labor, and so he offered citizenship to Athens. And he also allowed everyone, including people who did not own land or did not have personal wealth, to take part in government. And the first 3 categories there, this always I have to stop. Be careful. The Pentecostiumodimnoi, which are the people who produce 2,500, actually no, that's 25,000 liters a year from their holdings. The knights, the hippes, the zeugatai, and the yoked men. They were all, those groups, those demographics were always involved somehow in rule. But the 4th category, he actually made an official category, the thetes. And they now had a right, they could come to the assembly, they could be part of the decision-making process as well. And he also made it illegal to sell yourself into debt slavery. So all of a sudden you had a bunch of people who were back in Athens as not only as citizens, but now citizens contributing to the success of the polis. By the way, just to finish up the slide, hippes are knights. That means you can afford to keep and look after a horse and equip yourself to fight in the cavalry. That takes a fair bit of money because horses, they don't tend to use horses for plowing. Zeugatai means you own 2 oxen. And you have the 2 oxen there, they are used for farm labor. If you have that, means you can likely afford to equip yourself with all the gear you need to fight as an infantryman in battle. So, last word is the amount of say you have in government and how things are run in government is directly tied to your ability to defend the community. So the more, a knight is a more effective fighter than an infantryman. So they're higher up. And so it's very much tied to that. A Thede or a peasant is going to be a light armed troop in front of all the heavily armed troops. They're still fighting, but it's the least effective thing. So therefore, they get the least say in it. So that is a huge factor to keep in mind. It also explains why foreigners and slaves and women and children don't have any say in how the city is run, because they don't directly serve in the army. On that note, we'll pause.